Hi there, it's Cristo here on GB News. Now, I want to talk to you about a story that I can't get past this week. And I can't get past the fact that our Prime Minister has still said absolutely nothing about it. Now, 3 days after this man's murderer was convicted, this boy really. If anyone doesn't know this story, Henry Nowak, and there's a picture of him at his 18th birthday, 18-year-old student. And on the 3rd of December last year, he was murdered by a man named Vikram Digwar. Digwar was a Sikh man, and he claimed it was in self-defence. He said that Nowak was drunk and had barged into him, and that was a lie. After stabbing Nowak 5 times with an 8-inch blade, Digwar's parents arrived at the scene. His mother took and hid the ceremonial knife, kirpan knife, which is carried by some Sikhs, in order to protect her son and obviously hide what he'd done. Meanwhile, Nowak tried to escape after leaving a trail of blood behind him. When the police arrived, Digwar claimed he'd been racially abused by a drunken Nowak. Both of those things were lies. Nowak wasn't drunk. He hadn't racially abused Digwar. However, despite Nowak having extensive stab wounds, the police believed the version by Digwar, the murderer, and handcuffed Nowak as he was dying. Nowak told the police he'd been stabbed, and they didn't believe him. They told him, actually, he hadn't been stabbed. He told them, and this turned out to be the 18-year-old's final words in handcuffs: "I can't breathe." He then collapsed. He was drowning in his own blood from a stab wound to the chest. It was only then the police took off his handcuffs and administered first aid. But it was too late. He died. What would that poor boy have thought in his dying moments? At a time when he should have been given comfort, when he should have been... when he felt he should have been given comfort, and when he should have felt reassured, and when he should have felt love. Instead, his final moments would have been filled with the injustice of knowing that he was the victim, but was being treated like the one who was guilty. He must have been so scared. He'd been on a night out 1 minute, and then the next stabbed, dying, and those who were meant to help him were treating him as the guilty party. He wouldn't have known, as his life was slipping away, that we'd all eventually find out he wasn't racist and that the accusation was nonsense. He died thinking the world thought he was racist. He died knowing he'd been seen as the guilty one. And imagine that being your final thought. I have respect for the police, but those officers should be fired. It's right they're now being investigated. They're simply too thick or too steeped in political correctness to be serving officers. I'm amazed they haven't resigned in shame. How can you believe that a man who was bleeding to death was a threat? How can you not notice the blood? And let's say it was true. Let's say he'd done the worst thing in the world and he had been racist. Does that justify a stabbing? Justify such retaliation? You can be stabbed and still put in handcuffs. Didn't the officers for just 1 second take a step back and think, what's going on here? Have we got this right? Could we have been lied to? Aren't the police, of all people, meant to have critical thinking skills? No, because as we now know in our society, being called a racist is the worst possible thing. There is nothing worse. Racism is terrible. It's awful. I hate it. I hate that someone could be judged and held back by their skin colour. But we're now so scared of the accusation of racism, we're literally prepared to more or less let a man die in the street because of it. we've seen it elsewhere with grooming gangs, fear of being called racist, meaning that white girls were literally raped on a mass scale and allowed to be because no one did anything about it. Why? Because solving it or investigating it could lead to the accusation of racism, which is the worst thing ever. And now we've done it again. Racism is abhorrent, but so is allowing crimes to go unpunished because our fear of that accusation. We have got to stop. We've got to stop allowing the fear of racism or being accused of it being put over and above everything else. And Henry Nowak died and was wearing handcuffs seconds before he died. He wasn't given the help and kindness that he needed because of it. How have we got here? Where is the condemnation? Where is the sympathy from our leaders? At least the Sikh community have condemned what happened. Why haven't our leaders? Aren't they curious? Don't they care? We need to remember this boy's name, Henry Nowak. We need to stop this ridiculousness. We need to be angry about this because too often we're sacrificing our common sense and our decency and calling out what is wrong in our society for fear of racism, and I am sick of it. Okay, so we're now joined in the studio by David Shipley, who is a former prisoner and a crime journalist. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you for having me on.
I can't believe this story. I can't believe what that boy went through in his final moments, and we all know how awful it is when you have the injustice of like a parking ticket or something that you're accused of and you know that it's wrong. But whereas this guy was accused of the worst thing, and rather than being given love and affection and care and kindness, he was handcuffed and drowned in his own blood. I just can't get my head around it.
Yeah, and we imagine, don't we, how it might have been for him. I know I've thought about it a lot every time I read the details. You know, perhaps when his attacker phoned the police, Henry thought, that's good, they're going to get here, they'll help me out, you know, because you would assume the police would help the victim. And instead they turned up and they chose to prioritise the claims of racism by Nowak's killer and his family over the young man saying, I'm dying, I'm bleeding, I'm in pain, I've been stabbed, you know. It's astonishingly wicked, but I think you're right, of course, that the officers concerned should lose their jobs and perhaps be prosecuted for misconduct in public office. But this is part of a culture. I think that's the important thing. This is the culture of the state. And we talk about why does Keir Starmer not stand up about this? It's because he doesn't care about harms done to the white British people of this country.
Do you think it's that? Do you think that... because I think that... I can't imagine that he doesn't know or care what I think is happening, and it's almost worse because I think he knows what I think is happening, and it's not just Keir Starmer, it's other leaders that do this as well, is that it's an easy win to say you know, we see it from, like, I know that he's not involved in this, but we kind of see it from Sadiq Khan, we see it from other leaders as well, that it's easy to divide and sort of label people as far right or talk about the terrible divisions in our society rather than being balanced on it because it plays to the gallery.
I think that's part of it, but I do actually think there's an institutional anti-white bias in the country. And the reason I say it is not just because of tone, but if you look at, so earlier this year, the government published this big community cohesion strategy called Protecting What Matters. There's a forward by the Prime Minister. In that, it talks about hate crime, and it specifically says, it gives examples of people who've been the victims of hate crimes. It talks about Hindus, Muslims, Jews, and even Roma. It doesn't mention a single anti-white hate crime in there. The way the British state sees it is that, you know, hate crime is something which happens to non-white groups. You can't be hate crimed if you are the nation-forming group, the white British. And that is throughout the way the state thinks about this stuff. So I don't think it's just about communication. I do think there's a fundamental difference in how they see different groups.
Why is there a discomfort? Do you know what? I'm going to admit something now. Even I feel uncomfortable you saying that. Do you know what I mean? And I know it's true, and I'm sorry. I don't mean to sound like I'm sort of having prejudice here, because I'm not. But I even sometimes feel a little, oh God, can we say that when we're talking about it in the context?
That's what the government wrote. They published the report. You know,
I agree. I absolutely get it, and I even know that the problem exists. But even sometimes when we talk about a bias towards white people, my default is to go, actually, is that all right? And then you kind of go, yes, of course, because the evidence says that it's there. But it's almost like as a nation, we've been programmed to not be objective about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's this concept in sort of left social justice spaces that racism can't happen to white people, that white people can't be the victims of racism, and therefore I think perhaps there's a discomfort there. But this is, the government puts this stuff in black and white in the reports. In that same report, by the way, they describe the idea that English people are white or kind of broadly Christian as a far-right talking point. They literally... They are very clearly, if you read this report, and it's very long, but it is worth reading, it shows they are frightened of the nation-forming groups of these islands, the British, the Scots, the Welsh and the English.
That's absolutely just completely and utterly insane, because what it means is, of course, you don't solve the problem, and it means that they're not interested in solving the problem. You don't solve problems unless you identify that a problem is there. We could talk about this in the context of the grooming gangs as well.
Precisely.
You don't. It's easier to ignore the problem and let the people be sacrificed than actually try and solve the problem and get it out in the open.
Well, this is it. We have this squeamishness, I think, in our governing class. They don't want
that's a really
to talk about these problems.
They're squeamish. I think it's not. It's you're a bit like ooh, and you're right. You're right.
But the result is, of course, these terrible things happen. They're allowed to continue and continue. And the end point of this is, police officers on the front line turn up and no doubt, full of their anti-racism training, they focus on dealing with the claim of racism, not on the claim that someone's been stabbed. And
I got a lot of, not abuse, but I got a couple of people messaged me last night, because we spoke about this last night when I was on a different show here, on Patrick's show. And I said that although I thought they were awful and moronic and terrible and ridiculous and unforgivable and stupid, I almost felt a bit sorry for the police officers, in as much as they are so indoctrinated and so scared of their own shadow when it comes to the dreaded R word, that they probably have lost all objectivity when it comes to it, and it's almost an indoctrination.
I think it is. And since Macpherson, which was the investigation into the Stephen Lawrence killing, the police have been terrified of being seen as institutionally racist, and so they are, I think, they've gone too far the other way, and all the training and all the focus is on not being racist, by which they mean listening to claims of racism from non-white people. And this is the end point of it. The end point of this ideology is 3 police officers ignoring a dying white boy saying that he's been stabbed because they were listening to this Sikh family saying that he'd been racist. That's where this ideology takes us, and it's an ideology which kills, as we've seen here.
Well, last night when we were talking about it, Patrick was calling it a George Floyd moment, and I don't think it's a million miles away from that. I can't breathe being the last words. Unbelievable.
Terrific.
Listen, thank you for taking the time to talk to us today about this. This is David Shipley, who is a former prisoner and crime journalist. Okay. Well, the Sikh community have responded to this awful murder, saying that on behalf of Sikh organisations and communities across the country, we express our deepest condolences for the tragic loss of life. Thoughts and prayers remain with the Nowak family and loved ones during this profoundly difficult time. This incident, as reported, does not align with the Sikh faith, the Sikh community, or principles it stands for. Crime and Policing Minister Sarah Jones MP had this to say: "This is a truly horrific case, and my thoughts are with Henry's family and friends. No verdict can undo the pain they're living with, but I hope today brings some small measure of justice. It is right that an IOPC investigation has been launched into the actions of the police to get to the truth.